the Delta variant continues to spread, and Israel is seeing a worrisome surge in cases. As today, for the first time, the number of severely ill has reached 400 people. Now, as the numbers continue to rise and the government is struggling to contain the spread, introducing new restrictions in an attempt to avoid a fourth lockdown. Let's take a look at the report.
Prime Minister Naftali Bennett meeting with senior health officials in an emergency session Tuesday night to discuss the surge in coronavirus cases facing Israel. Health officials recommending a number of new restrictions in an attempt to curb the spread. The first, an extension of the Green Pass to include nearly all businesses and venues, from gyms to malls to restaurants. Proof of vaccination or recovery from COVID must be presented to gain admittance, and for those who are not vaccinated, proof of negative coronavirus test results are required. And all this will apply from children aged 3 and above. Officials are recommending limiting the number of people at indoor gatherings to 50 and outdoor gatherings to 100 at private home events, and those not subject to the Green Pass. The cabinet set to meet Wednesday afternoon to approve these measures and decide on a timeline for when they will go into effect. Additionally, the coronavirus cabinet is set to expand the number of rapid testing sites across the country. Currently, there are 150 sites where people can go and get a rapid test, providing results within 15 minutes. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett on Tuesday also visiting the Homefront Command and praising their efforts, saying that 90% of severe cases were people over the age of 50 and asking all citizens over 50 to, quote, be very careful in the coming weeks. While there, he also reiterated his call for Israelis to go and get vaccinated.
כל מי שמעל גיל 60 שעוד לא יצא להתחסן, שיתחסן. מבצע החיסונים הוא הצלחה גדולה. כבר 600,000 מאזרחי ישראל מעל גיל 60 יצאו להתחסן, זה כמעט 50% תוך כמה ימים. מדינת ישראל היא המדינה היחידה בעולם כרגע שמעמידה לרשות המבוגרים שבה אפשרות לחיסון משלים שלישי.
Meanwhile, the health ministry announcing Wednesday morning that some 5,755 new cases of coronavirus were detected Tuesday, slightly lower than Monday when over 6,000 new cases were reported, and the ministry also saying that 87 people are in critical condition and 62 are on ventilators. Israel is currently seeing the number of severely ill patients double every 10 days, and by health experts' estimates, will reach over 800 severely ill, possibly even 1,000 by the beginning of September, unless efforts are successful in containing the virus. So the question remains, will the government's efforts be enough to contain the pandemic, or is Israel headed to a fourth lockdown?
Israel continues to struggle to contain the Delta variant. Cases are surging, and from a country that was green only a few weeks ago, Israel has deteriorated back to the numbers of the third wave of the pandemic. Even the United States Center for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, has changed Israel's classification to level 4, the highest level, recommending that Americans avoid traveling to the country. So, how did we get here? Are we on the verge of a fourth lockdown? And how is this government handling the crisis compared to the previous one? Here to answer all these questions and more is Professor Manfred Green, Director of the University of Haifa's International Master's Program in Public Health. Welcome. So, first of all, how did we get to this point?
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thanks, given the circumstances. But I need to ask, how did we get to this point?
Well, you know, the virus is with us, and it's been with us, and it will be with us. So it's not just going to disappear. And as long as people who are infected come into contact with people who are either not vaccinated or not immune from the disease, it'll spread, and the Delta virus spreads very easily. So the only real impact that we'll see is if we prevent the spread by using masks, which is the most important thing, and making sure that this use of masks is enforced, because I think what I see is that it's not really really enforced. And I think we need to improve, obviously, the vaccination rates. We still have a large number of the population who are still not vaccinated.
And yet, I mean, Israel is a world leader in vaccine rollouts. And despite this, though, I mean, it seems we're on the verge of lockdown number 4.
Yeah, I think it's related very much, though, to the behavior of the population. And I think we need to make the message much clearer. at least when I go out into the supermarkets or into closed areas, I don't see that there's very much enforcement of using masks, for example, which is a simple protective measure. I think that should be done. I think it should be done in schools. I think it should be done where any large gatherings take place. And I think we should try and limit large gatherings because these are places that they're going to be spread, unless, of course, we can introduce very rapid testing of everyone who goes into the gathering.
Now, I mean, you say this, but on the other hand, Ayelet Shaked, Prime Minister Bennett's number 2, said yesterday that, well, this is a pandemic, and in a pandemic, people die, saying that the government has adopted a live alongside the coronavirus strategy and basically accepting that people are going to die. I mean, is this really the government's strategy? Are they looking perhaps to get herd immunity?
I don't think the strategy is to let people die. We certainly wouldn't want that to be a strategy. I think the strategy should be to minimize damage and to minimize death. And that, the way in which you do that is to minimize infections and make sure that the health services are adequately prepared to actually treat patients. So the more patients there are in hospital, the more difficult it is to treat them. So we need this increase in staff. The hospitals are generally very understaffed. There are not enough beds. The infrastructure is poor. We should be building more hospitals. Even now, we should be talking about building new hospitals. So that's another issue. But in general, we really need to make sure that people are protecting themselves and others, and in particular, using masks. Masks is a very good protective measure.
Absolutely. Now, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, while he was in the opposition, wrote a book on how to combat the coronavirus without lockdowns. And it seems that now we might as well, throw that book out the window. I mean, in fact, most of the ministers in this government were very critical of the previous government's handling of the pandemic. So I'm curious, how are they faring now in comparison? I mean, critics saying the government has imposed restrictions too little, too late to curb the surge in cases. I mean, do you agree?
A lockdown is a temporary procedure. So in any event, you can have a lockdown. It will temporarily halt or reduce the spread. Once you open the lockdown, it starts again. We need to really enforce the other measures. Much better ventilation and much less crowding in schools. Much better public awareness that they basically have to wear masks. The other thing, by the way, is the actual identification of people who actually are positive. That still seems to be a weak link where people are actually tested and either they don't know the result or the result doesn't get to the authorities. At least there's no connection. I hear of more and more cases of people who are tested positive and no one has contacted them. So they're not even sure that they have to be isolated or not. So this requires a much greater increase in staff who will actually be monitoring the cases and testing people to get the infected people out of circulation.
Absolutely. These are all crucial measures, and we hope that they will help in preventing the pandemic. Professor Manfred Greed, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you very much.
Now, in other news, Israeli Foreign Affairs Minister Yair Lapid departed today to Morocco in an historic visit, the first since reestablishing ties with the kingdom. While there, he will be inaugurating the Israeli diplomatic mission in Rabat and meeting with his Moroccan counterpart, Minister of Foreign Affairs, African Cooperation and Moroccan Expatriates, Nasser Bourita. The visit gaining historical standing for its continuation of firsts. This is both the first time a foreign minister will visit the country since the signing of the normalization agreement, and the first visit of an Israeli foreign minister in 18 years. Back in 2003, Israeli Foreign Minister Silvan Shalom making similar attempts to bring about normalization between the two countries. Now, Morocco and Israel have a history of unsteady relations with their low-level alliance from the signing of the Oslo Accords to being suspended after the Second Intifada in 2000. But with mutual threats from Iran, relations are starting to prosper again. And evidently, just last year, the two countries renewing partial diplomatic relations by reopening economic liaison offices in each other's lands. The only missing piece being Rabat's agreement to full normalization. But Lapid, remaining both optimistic and determined about his trip, had this to say, quote, "Now is the time for political economic activity, and we will continue to strive to reach agreements that bring innovation and opportunities to our countries." Moving on, Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett met up this morning with CIA Director William Burns, along with the designate head of the National Security Council, Dr. Yair Lapid, and head of Mossad, David Barnea, to talk about Iran. This happening after last week's missile shooting from Lebanon to Israel by Hezbollah, which sparked comments from both Israeli President Herzog and Defense Minister Gantz.
אנחנו רואים היטב את הניסיונות של חיזבאללה לנצל את המצב על חשבון ביטחונם ופרנסתם של אזרחי לבנון עצמם. וכל זאת בשליחות איראן. כפי שראינו גם במתקפה הימית שכבתה את חייהם של שני אזרחים זרים, איראן היא הסכנה הגדולה ביותר ליציבות העולמית והאזורית כאחד.
רק בסוף השבוע האחרון ראינו שוב את הפעילות של איראן ושלוחותיה בגבול הצפון. אם מישהו חושב שהוא יכול לאיים עלינו, הוא טועה טעות מרה.
In addition, a joint drill between the Israeli and the U.S. Air Force just finished yesterday, with both countries signaling to Arab countries in the area of an impending new alliance. So, could this be the beginning of a new alliance against Iran? What could Israel potentially gain from the CIA, and how could this affect the JCPOA? Well, joining us to discuss more is ILTV's Asaf Nissan. Asaf, so let's start off. Why are senior Israeli officials making such bold statements against Iran? I mean, how serious were Iran's actions this past week?
Iran's actions the past few weeks, Lidar, we've seen the missiles from the north, we've seen a lot of infiltration, we've seen all kinds of actions and a lot of strife against Israel that was done before. But even now, especially with Lebanon's economical and financial and every single crisis that's happening in the country, this is not surprising for us that Hezbollah is taking the opportunity to try to attack Israel. Now, of course, this is the reason we're giving such bold statements. Gantz is telling them that they cannot allow the country to go down south and go with Hezbollah and turn it into officially another proxy for Iran.
Now, I want to turn for a second to the CIA. I mean, what will Israel potentially gain from a deeper cooperation with the CIA? And, I mean, does this bode well with the Biden's administration's desire to go back to the nuclear negotiations?
So what I'm seeing from what's been given out so far, according to Channel 12, we've seen that the cooperation also has given Israel the chance to warn Iran, to warn the CIA that we're dealing with a new and crazy and mentally deranged leader. As they're saying, Ibrahim Raisi is considered mentally unstable. But furthermore, we're going to see a lot of intelligence cooperation that's been done for the past 30 to 40 years even, and it doesn't even change. It's just going to continue.
So it's just going to continue and it's ongoing. Now, let's talk about this joint drill that we saw. I mean, is this a signal to more moderate Arab countries in the region that there's a new alliance against Iran? Is that what the intent?
Well, it's not I wouldn't say the official intent, but it is pretty much a signal for countries like the UAE and Bahrain, especially since Bahrain hasn't officially signed the diplomatic ties with Israel. They're trying to also, I would say, entice them even to deepen their cooperation in order to create that new alliance against Iran. And Bahrain would be more than prudent, more strategic than anyone else, because Bahrain itself is bordering with Iran at some levels. So this would be potentially very helpful for Israel and the U.S. to have something like that.
All right, Asaf Nissan, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you so much.
China has reportedly hacked both the Israeli and Iranian private and public sectors, according to a report published on Tuesday by Israeli cybertech company FireEye. According to the report, a Chinese espionage group called UNC215 was responsible for the cyber attacks, exploiting the Microsoft SharePoint vulnerability. Working together with Mandiant and Israeli defense agencies, researchers reviewed data and found numerous potential attacks against Israeli institutions since 2019. And not only against Israel, but other countries in the Middle East, notably Iran. So here with more details on the ramifications of the alleged attack is Oren Elimelech, founder and CEO of Cyber Team 360 and a research associate at IDC Herzliya. So what can you tell us about these attacks? What is China after?
Hi. First of all, thank you for having me. These attacks have been going on in Israel for the last 2 years plus. But from knowing from other investigation that we have conducted and investigated, such attacks are happening constantly for the last 4 or 5 years. And everybody that's been involved in businesses in China actually gets silently hacked. And these attacks are mostly to gather intelligence. And when you do businesses in China, we see those threat groups from China going inside, scrumming to your emails, getting persistency into your environment in order to understand what is your motivation, what are your emails, what are your intentions before coming inside. And in the last year plus, we've seen big hacks, for example, Hafnium, happening on several companies, public, government, financial, insurance, getting persistency and having backdoors using web shells and other vectors in order to gather information. And sometimes these attack vectors are used also by other threat actors in order to encrypt their environment. But the intention from the Chinese is mostly to gather information.
Now, Israel and China have significantly also expanded business partnerships in recent years, both in the tech industry and in other areas. China's heavily invested here in Israel. I mean, isn't this a risky practice? And are Israeli companies aware of this, or is this something new that's come to light recently?
Very good question. So first of all, most Israeli companies are not aware of this. And as such, they're not taking the right action and activity in order to protect themselves. So yes, it's a wake-up call. And since Israel and China are tightly involved in, various businesses, for example, the Chinese harbor and, buying parts for operation, insurance and other businesses and capital here in Israel, I don't think it's going to change something. But we need to understand that the new norm of, hacking in order to get understanding, it's not something that only China does. Other countries are doing so as well. And, we're not that naive as well. But we need to understand that the new norm is when you are working today, you need to protect yourself in the cyber area. In this domain, we can gather so much information on you and have understanding. And we've seen this in the news, in the recent news about other companies, offensive companies that are being used. So this norm needs to be changed. We need to act accordingly and secure our environments because, it's a changing threat landscape.
Absolutely. Oren Elimelech, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you.
Now for some good news. Israel's first Olympic gold medalist in rhythmic gymnastics, Linoy Ashram, arriving back in Israel to a beautiful celebration at Ben Gurion Airport. Lifting the gold medal high above her head, Ashram takes a moment giving thanks to her coaches, sponsors, and fans for their support. The gold medalist won the final event over an early favorite, Russia's Dina Averina. But the contest sparked outrage from Russia over what Moscow was claiming was biased ruling. Judges have clarified that the win is legitimate despite Russia's protests. So this makes Ashram's wonderful welcoming home all the more exciting. Her victory making her the third ever Israeli Olympic gold medalist and the very first ever female Israeli gold medalist. Additionally, bringing further pride to Israel and being praised beside Linoy is fellow gymnast Nicole Zelikman, who placed in 7th at the same event. And now on a different note. If the coronavirus has taught us one thing, it's to cherish our loved ones. The global pandemic has separated families and friends. So what happens when someone you love passes away an ocean apart? How do Israelis deal with the issue of estate planning and inheritance? And why is it a good idea for us all to have a will? Well, joining us with some legal insight is advocate Anat Levy of Cohen, Decker, Pex, and Bosch Law Offices. Hi, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So when we deal with estate management, how do we work the inheritance out if heirs are living abroad while the estate is here in Israel?
Well, actually, the location of the heirs doesn't influence the distribution of the estate. Usually, it's better to nominate or to appoint an estate manager that will distribute the estate to the heirs. Usually, it's better to take someone neutral and not someone that is related to the deceased, because sometimes when the deceased appoint in his will somebody from the family, it can be somebody that can be not neutral, and then we will have a conflict of interest. Somebody that is familiar with the law in Israel, with the law outside of Israel sometimes, and also professional and dealt with those kinds of estate managements.
So if one of the heirs lives abroad but is entitled to his share of the estate, what happens then essentially?
Well, here there's another issue that it's not just the inheritance law in Israel, but the inheritance law in different countries that can come into effect, such as tax law that can influence the inheritance, because in Israel you don't have taxes on the inheritance, but in a different country you do have taxes, and therefore you need somebody that can understand these matters and can help the person, the heir, to receive the inheritance with less impact.
Now, could the inheritance go to the state? For example, if an heir who lives abroad doesn't claim his inheritance in Israel?
The answer is yes, but that's going to take a long time, and there's a unit at the Ministry of Justice, a unit that specializes in locating the heirs around the globe. And once you locate in them, you send them multiple notifications. Some of them do not wish to claim their share. They need to declare that, and it's irreversible. They cannot ask for it back, or they can just ignore it for years and years, and then eventually it will go to the state.
And what happens, I mean, we've heard stories of incidents like this. You know, what happens if someone doesn't believe that the will submitted, essentially, to the Registrar of Inheritance, I think that's what it's called, wasn't written or was tampered with, perhaps, or not signed by the deceased? What happens in cases like that?
So in cases like that, they can actually submit, of course, with someone who can deal with that, a lawyer that is familiar with that area of law, and submit an opposition to that will, but they will have to explain why they don't believe in that will. Did they really believe that somebody influenced that person? Do they really believe it's a fraudulent, it's not the real signature? Somebody forced him to sign something, and then, of course, they can submit an objection to that will.
So my final question is, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers are asking the same question, I mean, why is it so important to write a will, to have a will in the first place?
Yeah, it is very important to write a will. There's many reasons, but I'm just going to point to, if we're going to take an example of a young couple that accumulates stuff together and they wish to start their lives, and then something tragic happens. So you automatically believe that everything goes to the remaining spouse, when it's not the case, because usually you need to split whatever the couple have with the family of the deceased. I'm not going to say how much the share is, but you're not, you're left alone, and also you need to deal with, let's say if you have a house, then now you need to sell the house and split with the heirs, with the family of the deceased. There's another reason that automatically you also think that, after someone's death, you're going to divide everything among the heirs. But let's say if you have an elderly parent stayed alone and the kids wish to receive their share right now, so then the elderly will have to sell the house and split everything among the other heirs. So these are part of the reasons. There are many reasons why you should really write a will. Very recommended.
Absolutely. Advocate Anat Levy, thank you so much for your insight and for speaking with us today.
Thank you.
All right, well, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.23 shekels to the American dollar and 2.57 shekels to the Canadian dollar. And finally, for the latest updates and news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as to our newsletter at iltv.tv. I am the Dargaveh Lazi. Be well, and thank you so much for watching.